Thank you all for joining us today. If you could mute your mic, everybody but Amida, that would be great. I will be muting myself too soon as well, after I introduce our speaker for today. And today is the last colloquium of this season. So don't come back next week. No, it's that. Or you could come back. We could still have tea hour if people are interested. So that would be fine. But there won't be a talk next week. This is the last talk of the semester. And I am delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Ortega from our very own department. She's an assistant professor in the Math and Statistics department at Sonoma State University. I think she probably is the person in the department with the most degrees, because she has a BA in pure mathematics from Pomona College and also a BA in music from Pomona College. She also has a master's in math and from the University of Iowa, and a master's in public health from the University of Iowa, and a PhD in mathematics from the University of Iowa. She has worked at Arizona State University and as a healthcare analyst at Health Service Advisory Group. Her research interests are mathematical and computational biology, mathematical epidemiology in developing countries, infectious disease epidemiology, and her passion is working to increase the participation of math and minority in sciences. Some of the things that she's brought to Sonoma State is organizing the annual Sonia Kowaleski High School Math Day, and she's very active in the AWM and in the Math Alliance. Today, I'm delighted that she will be talking to us about the statistics behind driving while Black. So please help me welcome Dr. Omaida Ortega.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your applause. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this colloquium today, Dr. Lama. I very much appreciate it. Thank you for that warm welcome also. Yeah, I do have a lot of degrees. I couldn't stop. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. But thank you all for coming today. I want to get started. I'm very fearful that I might go over time, so I'm gonna just get to it. So I want to talk to you today about some of the statistics behind driving while Black. Okay, so before we get to that though, I was asked to talk about a little bit about my background. I just want to throw that in at the beginning. Also, just because of the topic, I thought it'd be more appropriate to talk about me first. And it would also maybe help to show why I'm motivated to work on topics like the statistics behind driving while Black. Okay, so I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Queens, New York, which is right about here where I grew up, Far Rockaway, Queens, New York, so right there in Rockaway Beach, right where Long Island and Queens meet. And that's a picture of me in approximately second grade, not really sure, but I am the product of two immigrants from Panama. My mother and father both emigrated to the United States. They both emigrated to New York. My mother when she was 14, my dad when he was 19, and they actually met at a party. They were at a Panamanian party when they met, and the rest is history. Aside from myself, I have two older brothers who actually, we all live in California now, but we all started our lives in New York. So then, with respect to education, I went to public school for elementary and middle school in New York, and then I was nominated for a program called Prep for Prep 9, and that stands for Preparation for Preparatory School. And so after doing this program, I went to boarding school in Massachusetts. I went to Milton Academy, and so this is just outside of Boston. It's a suburb of Boston, Milton, Massachusetts. And after high school, I went on to college at Pomona College in Southern California. And while I was an undergraduate at Pomona College, I did a summer REU program. It's a research experience for undergraduates. That was, ooh, my ordering's a little out of the way. Oh, that makes sense. Let's come back. Forget the REU for now. After my first year at Pomona, I like to talk about this because I think a lot of people experience some difficulty in their time in college. After my first year at Pomona, I was put on academic probation and I was suspended. And so I went to De Anza Junior College here in the Bay Area. It's in Cupertino in San Jose. I went there for a year before I was readmitted into Pomona College. And so I finished my undergraduate career at Pomona College. And while I was there, I participated in a research experience for undergraduates. I participated in the Mathematical and Theoretical Biology Institute, MTBI. At the time, it was housed at Cornell University. But in this REU, I met one important mentor for me. The director of MTBI, Carlos Castillo Chavez, was a professor at Cornell when the institute was there, and then he brought MTBI with him to Arizona State, where MTBI is housed to this day. So that experience also will come into play later in my career trajectory as well. Okay, so now between undergraduate and grad school, I did another program. It's not an REU, but it has sort of a similar slant. The EDGE program, it's Enriching Diversity in Graduate Education, and it's the EDGE program for women. And in particular, I believe there were 8 of us or 10 of us, but women who are about to go into grad school. And this program essentially prepares you for I think it was just analysis and algebra at the time that I was in EDGE. It has since evolved since 2001 when I was in EDGE. But this program also influenced my career later on. So I went to grad school and I went to the University of Iowa, where I got a bunch of different degrees. When I was there, I was essentially just pursuing my different interests. And these interests were spawned from that REU program that I did earlier. So at MTBI, they focus on applied mathematics and taking mathematics and applying it to biology. And in that program, I saw that I could sort of marry my love of mathematics with my love of public health and with medicine. And so because of that, that was the focus of my graduate study when I was at Iowa. And while I was at Iowa, I got a master's in public health sort of by chance. I just realized that I had completed all of the coursework for that degree, with the exception of one class. So I finished that class and got my MPH, my master's in public health. I also got a master's in applied math and computational sciences along the way, as well as my PhD in applied mathematics and computational sciences. Then after Iowa, I got my first job at Arizona State University. And so this is also just a little bit of advice as you're looking for your jobs. And I feel like I figured that out now, but when I was a grad student, fresh out of grad school, I didn't know that you should look for a school that is the right fit for you. And so I loved being at Arizona State, but Arizona State has this very high research expectation. And so there's sort of the way that you divide up your time. You sort of have 100% of your time. And at Arizona State, they expect you to spend something like 60% of your time on research, 20% on teaching, 20% on service. So the distribution is very different, say at a teaching institution where you might have an even expectation or more heavily towards teaching. So every institution is different, but I was at Arizona State. I spent 9 years there and I learned so much during that time, but it wasn't quite the right fit. And so what happened was I left academia altogether. And I started as a data analyst at the Health Services Advisory Group in Phoenix. And that was also a really wonderful experience to learn what it is to do statistical consulting and to do mathematics for a client, for a business client. But after a couple of years, I realized that I missed teaching. I was still working in summer REUs and summer programs for students. And so I just really missed teaching. And so then I had a brief stint. I went back to Pomona College briefly before landing this amazing job at this amazing institution, Sonoma State University. Okay, where I am now. Okay, see, you can see it. This is where I am now. Okay, so enough about me. Oh, not yet. One more slide. I love being a teacher. I talked about the pull of teaching is why I came back to academia. I think being a teacher is so amazing. I know many people in the audience are, they're future teachers. They're studying or majoring in mathematics education. And so it is such an amazing path. And I applaud you. You get to be a steward of your students' gaze. So you can open up opportunities for them, open up different whole disciplines for students that they didn't know about. So for instance, I just wanted to go to an REU. I didn't really know about the different disciplines in mathematics. So that summer spent, with MTBI was really important for me because it just showed me, oh, look what else you can do with math. There's so many different disciplines in mathematics. There's so many different disciplines, period. So it's important for teachers like us to show these different opportunities, these different experiences to our students. And we can influence our students in both subtle and intentional ways. And so in particular today, I chose to talk about driving while Black, or the statistics behind driving while Black, to very intentionally influence my students, but maybe to influence their future work as well. So first off, I want us all to just take a moment and maybe even, and I want you to think about, what does it mean? What does that phrase mean, driving while Black? What does it mean to you? We can't sort of do think, pair, share in this setting. So if you could pause for a moment and think about this, and if you're willing to share, if you could share in the chat. Okay, and then if you're not willing to share, I can also move on, because I have my own ideas. Okay. So.
Oh, I can speak up.
Okay, thank you.
It's a common phrase to refer to the tendency for police to stop Black people, but more generally people of color than white people, for doing the same thing. They're arrested more for speeding and things like that. So it isn't just driving, it's just basically doing anything. Mm-hmm. And I am married to a person of color, Native American, and so I've seen this close up. I mean, I'm white, I don't have the problem, but he does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Rick. I also want to share something that was typed in the chat from Ben Ford. Driving while Black is being targeted by police for special scrutiny or stops because of skin color. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I also just wanted to share an example as sort of to help the definition. So in St. Louis, there was sort of this growing racial unrest, social and racial unrest, because it seemed that the police were using traffic stops to raise revenue, and they were pulling over African Americans more often than others. So it was alleged that the police department in St. Louis was racially profiling African Americans, and so disproportionately fining them. And this study, this federal report was conducted and actually found this to be true, that African Americans were pulled over 10 times more often than their white neighbors. And this was a study that was done in 2014. This excerpt that I have here is from an article in 2018 from a Missouri newspaper called the Missouri Guardian. And it also talks about sort of the consequences of this practice. It's not just, oh, well, so the African-American people are paying more fines, or 10 times more fines. And so they're sort of losing this financial gain. But in particular, if you read the small text here, this individual, Eric Smith, who's from Hazelwood, Missouri, had been pulled over and had not paid his traffic fines. And so he turned himself into the police because he had these outstanding traffic fines and traffic violations. And while he was in jail, he had been assaulted and nearly died due to that assault. So this is just one situation and an extreme example, but there can be more consequences beyond just getting pulled over, the hassle of being pulled over, the hassle of having to pay a fine.
Well, Myra, could I mention one other thing that I think is very distressing? There was a case a year or two ago, I think in Missouri, where a woman who was Black was pulled over by the police for having a taillight out, and 10 minutes later she was dead.
Oh, that's Sandra Bland, I'm sorry, and she's also featured in a video that I'll show in a little bit.
Oh, okay, you know about this already.
Yeah.
But I think, that goes to show how this can escalate. I mean, a taillight and she's dead in 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. That's why this is a very serious problem.
Okay. excuse me. One other definition that I want to share comes straight from our Department of Justice. This is a definition for racial profiling. Racial profiling is any police-initiated action that relies on race, ethnicity, or national origin, rather than the behavior of an individual or information that leads the police to a particular individual who has been identified as being or having been engaged in criminal activity. Okay, so publicly, our justice system condemns racial profiling, but this practice still continues. Okay, and so this is the beginning of the video that I want to show you. Oh, hold on. I had trouble with this before. Ah.
I have been stopped by the police about 4 times in the last 60 days. A total of 5 times I've been pulled.
We lost sound, Amanda.
I think it may be because I muted myself to cough. Hold on.
I have been stopped by the police about 4 times in the last 60 days. A total of 5 times I've been pulled over.
Probably more than 20 times.
It's more times than I care to remember. But what you do know is how a very familiar feeling comes each time I'm stopped.
When I see a police officer behind me and the flashes go off, or they're just driving behind me, I'm nervous.
I'm conscious of my speed limit.
It's always nerve-wracking for me.
I'm gonna stop a car. They have reason to pull it over. The driver looks more like one of our suspects just because of the white set and all.
You never know what's going to be the outcome of a traffic stop if you're a black man. So I go through my procedures.
I try to stay as calm as possible.
Like turn on my light.
You don't get out of the car. I make sure that my seatbelt is on right away, windows down.
So he can immediately see there are no weapons.
My hands need to be visible.
I don't immediately reach for the glove box.
10 and 2, they'll have my hands on the steering wheel.
I speak to them in a respectful manner.
Record the badge number in my head.
Have the officer feel safe.
Because they're on edge, you're on edge, and if somebody says or does the wrong thing, this could turn into something absolutely crazy in 60 seconds or less.
Get out of the car!
And then
I will light you up. Get out!
Wow.
Now!
Wow.
Get out of the car!
For a failure to signal. You're doing all of this for
Get over there.
Right, yeah. Yeah, let's take this to court.
Go ahead.
Okay, and so this actually is exactly, it ended with exactly the video of the dash cam from the Sandra Bland situation, because it never even escalated to a case, to a court case, I mean to say. But so that was really timely, your comment, Rick. But I wanted to share this video to share some personal accounts of people who have experienced driving while black, who have experienced racial profiling. Now, one of the landmark cases regarding racial profiling is this State versus Soto case that was tried in New Jersey. And it had to do with a particular stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike. Now, the defendant, his lawyers actually, they conducted a statistical experiment. They did a statistical analysis to use as evidence in court. And this analysis was used successfully so that Soto won this case because of the statistical analysis that was done. So I want to describe this experiment. So there was a particular stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike, And on this particular stretch, 43,000 cars were observed. And this is during different time periods, but always in this one particular stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike, the same stretch where Pedro Soto was pulled over. Now, within these 43,000 observations, it was noted that 13.5% of the cars contained either African-American drivers or passengers. Then within these 43,000 observations, so 43,000 cars, they observed 2,000 cars that were in violation of speed laws. And so speeding was the #1 reason why cars were pulled over. So that's also why they looked for this in particular. Also keeping in mind, this is an experiment done by lawyers, so they don't necessarily have access to registration records and the other types of things that police officers might pull people over for. Within these 2,000 cars that were speeding, the experimenters also noticed that 15% of the drivers who were speeding were African Americans. Okay. Now, they took this observational data and they compared it to the fact that of the stops in that region, I've forgotten what the exact time period was, but it was within a single year, that 35% of those stopped by the police for speeding were African American. So now, because of this disparity, the difference between the 15% of drivers that were speeding and the 35%, or it could also be argued the difference between the 13.5% of African American drivers on the road and 35% of those were stopped by police. For this reason, the judge ruled against the state and in favor of Pedro Soto. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can think about this problem. So I had also compared to either the 15% of the drivers that were speeding with the assumption of making the assumption that on average 15% of people doing something that would cause them to get pulled over, 15% of the time, those people would be African Americans. But we could have also compared it to the 13.5%. However, since 15% is a larger number, I'm going to use that number for comparison. And we're actually going to do a hypothesis test. So I did this because I actually had a student in my introductory statistics class say, "Are you going to do any hypothesis tests in your presentation?" And I said, "I will for you." And so we're making a claim here, and the claim is that African American drivers get pulled over more often than other drivers. Okay, and so when we're making that divide between African American and other because that's the data that we have. Now, our null hypothesis is that the proportion of people who get pulled over who are African American is this 15%. So the proportion that get pulled over in that sense should match the proportion of drivers who are speeding, that proportion that are African American. Now, our alternative hypothesis is that that proportion is larger than 15%. Okay, so more than 15% of the people who get pulled over are African American. And so we're going to use this point estimate of this 35% of drivers that actually got pulled over in that time period that we were using for comparison in the State versus Soto case. Okay, so then I'm going to use stat key to then calculate a p-value and make a conclusion. Okay, so here, using that previous data, we created a randomization distribution and then tested that point estimate of 35% and found quite a small p-value. It's essentially 0, okay? So for that reason, we would reject the null hypothesis with this very low p-value. In general, our significance level that we assume is 5%. We could really use just about any acceptable significance level with a p-value of 0, and we would still reject the null hypothesis. So we can say that African American drivers do get pulled over more often than other drivers. Okay, and so you might have said also, well, maybe you wanted to do a difference of proportions as opposed to just looking at that one proportion. I'm not going to go into this as much as I did the previous one, but similarly looked at that difference of proportions calculated a randomization distribution so that I could do a hypothesis test and get a p-value. It doesn't matter what kind of test you do, you still get a teeny tiny p-value. Okay, and by teeny tiny, I mean essentially 0. Okay, so it doesn't even matter what significance level we choose to use, we would still reject the null hypothesis. And this is also why it was so easy for the judge to rule in favor of Pedro Soto and rule against the state, because the p-value was so small, there wasn't any room for argument there. And even though the judge was not a statistician themselves, there wasn't room for argument. Okay, so to switch gears a little bit, I want to talk about probabilities. So probabilities are related to statistics very much, but it's a slightly different field, probability, but a lot of the ideas transferred. So probability is essentially used for statistical inference. We use statistics for statistical inference as well. But just to think about this range of values, we know that 0, a value of 0 for a probability means this event will never happen. This outcome will never happen. A value of 1 means this outcome will absolutely happen. And so we can use these values from 0 to 1, or we can use 0% up to 100%, but they mean the same thing. Now, I want to give just a basic frequency-based definition of a probability. So when we're dealing with events, we like to name them by capital letters. So let's just say we want to know what's the probability of some event A happening. And the probability of event A, we use this notation, probability of A, is just going to be in our numerator, the number of ways that that event A can happen, and in the denominator, the number of outcomes in general, like the number of ways anything can happen. And so if you've taken probability before, essentially in your denominator, you want to have your whole sample space, the size of your sample space. In the numerator, it's just those specific values that correspond to that event A. Okay, so now further, I want to start talking about the conditional probability. So sort of just generally, when I'm thinking about a conditional probability, it's the probability of one thing conditioned on the fact that this other event happened. So both events have to happen, but there's an order to it as well. So just thinking in terms of that general notation, an event A, an event B. So how I would read this conditional probability here is the probability that an event A occurs given that an event B occurs. So they sort of have to happen in order. And then if you're more sophisticated in probability, this is the formula. I'm assuming maybe you've seen it before if you're more sophisticated in probability. The only new thing in here, if you haven't seen these probabilities before, would be this intersection at the top. So a lot of times when I'm teaching conditional probabilities, I think you might just sort of like talk through a conditional probability. Sometimes you can think them through, but there's also a formal way of calculating a conditional probability. And in your denominator, you're going to have the probability that the event B happens. So this is the event that must happen. That's in your denominator. And then the probability of A then is sort of that. So this B is the conditioning event. And then in our numerator, we need the probability that they happen together. So this notation here, that upside down U, is my intersection. So to calculate a conditional probability, in my numerator, it's the probability that those two events happen together, divided by, in my denominator, the probability that that second event happens at all. Okay, now why am I even talking about this? Because this relates to the calculations we were doing before. So if we think about the proportions that we saw from the Soto case, we can think about the probability that you're black given that you're pulled over. So this probability that you're black given that you're pulled over corresponds to that 35% from before. So the event getting pulled over, that happened. That data has been recorded, that the police are required to record that data. And also while they're recording that data, write down things, demographic information like race, gender, age, those types of things. So being pulled over is the conditioning event, and then the probability that someone is Black, given that they're pulled over on that stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike, would be that 35%. And this other conditional probability that we're looking at is going to be the probability that a driver is Black, given that they're speeding. That conditional probability was also given in the previous piece of information. Remember, it was, excuse me, 15% of those cars that were found to be violating the speed laws were also found to be in cars driven by Black people. Okay, and so here I also have them in relationship to each other. Essentially, this equation is saying if the probability that you're Black given that you're pulled over exceeds the probability that you're Black given that you're speeding, then that's some evidence that Black people are being disproportionately pulled over. Okay, now we could look at it that way, and I said there were a couple of ways that we could look at it. We could have also compared just the proportion of people in the population that are Black. So in particular, we could have looked at this conditional probability of getting pulled over given that you're Black. How does that relate to just the underlying proportion of Black people in the United States? Okay, so now we could have used that, and so I'll show you a little bit of the distribution of the population in the United States. And here you'll notice that African Americans, or people who self-identify as Black or African Americans on the last US Census, there were 13.3% of the US population. So that number is in line with what we were seeing from the observations that were taken in the Soto case. But still, even these little decimal point differences still can give you different results, similar results, but different results. And so that's actually a big area of discussion when talking about driving while Black, is what benchmarks are you using? Essentially, what's your baseline? Are you comparing to the general US population? Are you comparing to the population in that city? In the Soto case, they were very specific, and they compared only to the population on that stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike. It wasn't even the whole New Jersey Turnpike. It wasn't all of New Jersey. It was just that little stretch. So that also sort of restricted it in some ways, or restricted their sample even more specifically to the driving population as well. Because if we were to use the overall population data, then we're taking in people who may not be old enough to drive. We're taking in people who choose not to drive. So there's a lot of other little factors that you have to consider. So with these benchmarks, you should also think about the ethics of choosing certain benchmarks. We talked about overall population data. We talked a little bit, well, census data where I drew the population data from tends to undercount underrepresented minorities. In general, underrepresented minorities don't like to fill out the census, or at least historically. They have chosen for many different reasons not to complete the census. So for that reason, the census undercounts people of color. Now, in this situation, in the state versus Soto, should we have just looked at licensed drivers? You know, if we were going to use the general population as a benchmark? And also, where do we set our regional boundaries? And I ask these questions as well because my talk is in general about driving while Black. I'm not saying I'm only going to talk about driving while Black on the New Jersey Turnpike. I'm only going to talk, you know, in these specific regionalities, because this phenomenon has been shown to happen all over the country, if not all over the world. And so I think the easiest way to convince people is to have sort of the strong statistical evidence, but then it also has to be sound. So you have to think about what benchmarks you're using. And so a little bit more about the regional benchmarks, just to show it locally. So initially I tried to get in police data on Roanoke Park, and they don't collect it here. So the best I could do was Santa Rosa, but they don't collect detailed information down to the demographics, or at least they don't share it. They don't share that information. But either way, if I were considering what regional boundaries would I use if I were to do a study in Roanoke Park, I mean, would I restrict my these demographic information, this distribution of race, would I restrict it to Roanoke Park? Would I restrict it to Sonoma County, California, or the United States? And if I look at the distributions of race in these different regional boundaries, these different regions, you'll notice they differ significantly in these different regions. And in particular, I would look at the first set of bars for Hispanic or Latino. Notice how much variation there is with the percentage that they make up of the population when we expand our regions from Sonoma County in orange, California in navy, and the United States in blue. Okay, so now to sort of avoid having to deal with these regional benchmarks, I'm going to look at a specific set of data, and so it's a very specific set of police stops. And so sort of the region sets itself, but we're just going to look within the set of people who have been stopped. Okay, so I want to know something about what happens after someone gets stopped. Okay, because it's difficult to sort of set these, like I said, the regional boundaries as well as the benchmarks with respect to how many people, what distribution of people are stopped in the first place. So what happens after an individual is stopped? Okay, so in particular, the LAPD has really, really great data. And so there's really great data for the LAPD. There's really great data for this, I'm sorry, the Soto case that I just talked about, and also Maryland Police Department. It's surprising that it's just those 3 places where there's really great data, but it generally, it happens because something bad happened there, and so then they're required by the federal government to do this sort of record keeping and reporting. And so in 1991, there was a really terrible case of police brutality. Rodney King is an African-American driver who, unfortunately, when he was being pulled over, tried to get away. And when he did stop, then he was terribly brutalized, and it was caught on tape. That was the other thing. Someone was videotaping the whole thing. So it became a huge thing. I encourage those of you that aren't old enough to remember this to look it up. But because of that, we have this great data. So now with the LAPD, I'm looking here at just that progression from once a driver is stopped, what proportion of African Americans are then searched? What proportion of white Americans are then searched? And then overall, over all the drivers, what proportion progress from being pulled over to then being searched? And so you'll see pretty much across all these timelines. So these are each these 6-month periods throughout 2014 in the beginning, 2004 and the beginning of 2005, there's a really big disparity between the percentage of African Americans who stops then progress onto a search rather than compared to their white counterparts. And this is true for each of these time periods. Okay, so now we notice overall that African Americans make up 19.5% of those who were stopped. And however, African Americans make up 27.7% of those that were searched. And so the absolute disparity, this is just subtracting those numbers from each other, is going to be 8.2%. But if we think about the relative disparity, that's the absolute disparity divided by the proportion of the population that they represent. This shows that there's a 42% relative disparity. And so African Americans who are pulled over are 4 times more likely to be searched than white drivers. Okay, so it's always good to look at this rather than looking at these absolute disparities to compare the relative disparities, because it takes into account what proportion of the population African Americans represent. Okay, so now we also think, well, could this be by chance? Again, this is a hypothesis testing. So now, could this be by chance? No. So the p-value was actually outside 95 standard deviations from the mean. Okay, if you remember, at least with the standard normal, normally, or 95% of your data lies within 4 standard deviations. I'm sorry, 2 standard deviations. So 2 above, 2 below. The p-value for this was outside of 95 standard deviations. I'm not even going to show you a picture for that because that just looks silly. Okay. So it was not by chance. You know, but wait a minute. What if the officers were actually justified in making these searches? Okay, and so what would make the search justified if the search resulted in the discovery of weapons, drugs, illegal possessions, or contraband? Okay, so now police refer to this as a hit if you find contraband. So we look at the searches where a discovery was made and we look at the proportions. We actually see that overall, it's actually more likely that when you search the vehicle of a white driver, that you would find contraband, as compared to an African-American driver. Okay, and same as before, I want to compare that absolute disparity and the relative disparity. So again, African-Americans make up 27.7% of those searched. African-Americans make up 37.9% of those where nothing was found during the search. So that absolute disparity is 10.2%. The relative disparity is 36.8%. So when I calculate that all together, we see that it's almost, let's say 3.5 times more likely that when an African-American person is searched, that you're not going to find anything. So that means that these high search rates of African-American drivers, it's not justified by the outcomes of the search. Okay, so now we might also be thinking, well, why do police even search in the first place? So in particular, if you're stopped and the police officer sees an open alcohol container or sees some sort of illegal drug activity, or you might be engaged in illegal drug activity if the car is stolen or if there's stolen property in the car. But also, if the driver is on parole, the police officer can automatically search. In fact, they have to in many states. So in this last bullet, parole status as a cause for search, African Americans are actually overrepresented in our incarcerated population in the US, and thus they're overrepresented in this class as well of people who have searches conducted on their vehicles due to their parole status. So we were just curious to see if maybe if we took out those situations when a driver was searched because of their parole status, if we remove those, what would our statistics look like then? Okay, and so here we notice that African Americans make up about 19% of those stopped. And also African Americans make up 25% of those searched. Okay, so with this information, we calculate an absolute disparity of 6%, a relative disparity then of 31.4%. Okay, so again, that relative disparity stays, it's smaller, but it's still there, saying that African Americans are just over policed, and that cause, that rationale for stopping them is not because there's a high hit rate. Okay, still 3 more times likely. So I'm repeating what I just said. Fantastic. Okay, so I want to show you the end of the video. So it goes back to Sandra Bland, and give me 1 second. Hopefully I don't have the same technical issues that I did before. Oh, yeah, I did. I'm comfortable not showing you the rest of that video. I want to encourage everyone to look at this video. It was a National Geographic special that was, and it's like hours long. But the video that I'm showing you is actually, it's just a teaser for this video, but it gives some really great points. I think that the main thing that I wanted you to get out of that video is just that these stops have these lasting negative effects. They've been proven to not be effective or even justified. This disproportionate policing of African Americans, this disproportionate number that are being pulled over. So for that reason, we should figure out ways to stop this and to curb this. And so I'm a statistician. I don't have all the answers for that. But I do understand that there are these lasting effects that this disproportionate, policing and being pulled over and racially profiled leaves drivers feeling frightened and humiliated, violated and angry. And so these are actually quotes that I took out of the video, and in general leaves certain races wary of police and wary of their motives. And so you distrust these people that are supposed to be peace enforcers. And so it's important that law enforcement try to regain the public's trust, because a lot of the public does not trust law enforcement. Okay. So that is all that I have to share today. I did want to also share some references. I know that many of you may want to continue learning more about this topic. So there's a great article in Chance Magazine. I'm pretty sure that you can get the PDF without having a subscription to Chance. It's called Driving While Black in the City of Angels. And this is where much of the data that I have comes from, that LAPD data. This is done by Dr. Lily Kajavi from Loyola Marymount University and some students. And they actually did this work and wrote this paper in a summer research program. There's also more LA specific data at this website, it's lacity.org. There's a really great guide that also lists some other some other sources of data called By the Numbers, a guide to analyzing race data from vehicle stops. And there's a textbook that the author is also posted a PDF of the entire textbook called The Pragmatics of Uncertainty. In this textbook, there's a whole chapter on different court cases that use statistics to, sway the jury to sway the judge one way or another. And so it shows a lot the power of statistics and the power of numbers and knowing how to analyze and understand and interpret these numbers. Okay, I guess the one last thing I do want to say, Stanford University also has this open policing project, and that is where I was able to find data on Santa Rosa, and they're very helpful, in particular in responding to emails as well as responding to questions that you might have about their data and what you can get from them. Okay, so that is all I have to say. So thank you so much for listening to my talk today on the statistics behind driving while Black. I hope that you are inspired to use your analytical skills for the greater good. So to use your skills in mathematics and your skills in statistics in service of the greater good. So I want to answer the first question that was submitted to me. What do you love most about mathematics? So I really love mathematics because I feel like you can do anything with mathematics. There are an infinite number of applications of mathematics. And so you can use mathematics, you can use statistics to solve problems in any field. So my research tends to be in public health and infectious disease. So I use mathematics and I use statistics to create mathematical models of infectious disease. And so I want to look at the spread of infectious disease. I also want to sometimes use models to consider different preventative strategies. Which one's going to be the best? Which one's going to be most effective? Which one's going to be the most cost effective of all the strategies? And so you can use math as a means to actually save money rather than trying these different strategies to prevent disease, which, there's some ethical implications to actually trying out different prevention strategies on actual humans. Rather than, trying these out on humans, you can use a mathematical model to simulate this experiment. And from those simulations, then choose the best course of action. And then after, vetting these processes, then proceed with the most cost beneficial, the most, ethical, the most effective of all the strategies. Okay, so question number 2 is, what was your favorite math topic as an undergraduate? As an undergraduate, I was really intrigued with all my math classes. Although this isn't my field, I really thought abstract algebra was really cool. I really just loved the way that, the numbers connected with, it was sort of, there was like this underlying geometry or like crystal structure. I felt like in abstract algebra, this like regularity in the numbers that, you see that in number theory as well, though I never took a number theory class. But I just really thought abstract algebra was so beautiful. And I think that if I did not end up being a mathematical epidemiologist, I probably would have been an algebraist. When I was an undergrad, we studied from Joseph Gallien's book on abstract algebra, and it was just so beautifully written, and like it was like the tone was just so friendly and colloquial that I felt like I was learning from a friend. And so I think that really just sort of predisposed me to love abstract algebra. I think like even specifically, I thought the CELO theorems were just so beautiful. Yeah, so I liked abstract algebra the most as an undergrad. How did I prepare for grad school? Well, I'm going to be honest, I didn't know I was going to go to grad school initially. I was going to be a math major. I was a math and music double major, so I was just taking the required coursework. When you're a double major, you kind of don't have a whole lot of wiggle room in what you can do. My junior year, is that right? Yes, my junior year, it was suggested that I do an REU, a research experience for undergraduates. And so that's a summer program where you go away for about 8 weeks and you do a lot of math. And I went to Cornell University. They had the Mathematical and Theoretical Biology Institute, also known as MTBI. I was in that program in 2000. And it was sort of a life-changing experience. Honestly, before that, I was going to be an algebraist. And then I went through MTBI and I became a mathematical epidemiologist. And so that's where I learned about mathematical modeling. That's where I learned that, you can take mathematics and apply it to public health. You can apply it to infectious disease. Before this, or even when I started undergraduate, I always knew I was going to be a double major in math and music, but I was also pre-med. And sort of along the way, I sort of fell off. My chemistry classes were not kind to me. And so I stopped being pre-med, but I still wanted to study medicine to some degree. And so knowing that I could still be a healer and still work in medical fields with mathematics was a revelation for me. And so I knew that that was the field that I wanted to go into. But preparing for graduate school, I would say that it would be good to attend a research experience for undergraduates. So an REU program, because it was in that REU program that I really learned about grad school and learned what would be required of me in grad school and learned what I could do after grad school. And that's really when I decided that I wanted to be a professor of mathematics. What was the most challenging part of grad school, and how did you handle it? Oh, I love these types of questions. So the first year of grad school was very hard for me. I grew up in New York City and I went to the University of Iowa for grad school. So I think there was a huge culture shift. Also, I went to undergrad in LA, but it was just a huge culture shift to move to Iowa. But also it was hard. It was really hard. I think it's similar to that shift from high school to college, is that suddenly you're like new fish in a even bigger pond, and you have no idea, what dangers lurk or what's expected of you. It was just so new, and just the rigors of grad school, I think, were difficult for me. As an undergraduate, I still did a lot of extracurriculars. I still hung out a lot, and in grad school, I didn't have as much time. I still spent a lot of time with the other folks in my program, we would always study together. The University of Iowa was a very community-focused math program. But even so, that first year was really, really difficult for me. I think that I was, homesick for my friends in LA. I was homesick for my family. And also the weather was intense in Iowa. I think that first winter, I pretty much just wore my snowboarding gear from California. And my friends who were from the Midwest laughed at me, but I was warm, and look, I still have all my fingers, and you can't see it, but I still have all my toes as well, despite having lived in Iowa for 5 years. How did I handle? I would say also the community at Iowa was very supportive, so incredibly supportive. I really don't think that I would have made it through without the support of the other people in my program, the people in my cohort, the people ahead of me, even the people behind me, the faculty members there, like Phil Kutzko, Jean Madison, my thesis advisor, Herb Heathcote, were all just incredibly supportive. E. Lee, David Mandershag, these are all people that I was very fortunate to have around me during that critical time in my life, because I feel like if I didn't have that community, I wouldn't have finished. So it was very important for me to have built a very supportive network for myself in grad school. I knew who I could study with. I knew who I could complain to. I knew who I could ask for help. And those are all very important things to have. I just want to also say my last year was really hard. Before I was actually done and could successfully defend, I started a job. I started my first position at Arizona State University. And so trying to complete my dissertation, write my thesis, trying to do all that while my thesis advisor had retired and had moved to the Northwest of the United States. And then I was in Arizona. We were just all over the place. It was really very difficult to just sort of like complete the degree, like dot the I's and cross the T's. So I wouldn't suggest that anyone do that. Try to not start a position before you've actually finished your dissertation. But it also required a lot of motivation on my part and a lot of determination to actually get it done. And I'm thankful that I did, but my first year and my last year were my hardest. Any general advice for students considering pursuing the doctorate? I would highly suggest doing research as an undergraduate. So I talked about REU programs that sort of, usually you go away and you're at another institution, or it might be at your own institution, although I would suggest going someplace else, because oftentimes when you go someplace else, those people are going to be your scientific community. Those are going to be your collaborators. That's going to be your support, those people that you meet, the friends that you make in your REU, and even, your research advisors in your REU program are going to be the people writing letters of recommendation for you when you go to grad school. And they may be, your early collaborators or even your lifelong collaborators. So I would say without seeming like you need to like go out and make this happen, you should start building your network. So you need to start building your scientific community, your network that's going to support you throughout your career. So these are, pretty much it's your friends. So the people that you're in grad school with, the people that you do research with, the people that you're in these REUs with, or these different summer programs or workshops even. I know that there are a lot of mathematical institutes throughout the United States that do programming throughout the year. And so it may be a weekend-long workshop on, I don't know, abstract algebra or something like that. Or, I think I did a workshop on, they called it computational epidemiology, I think was the terminology at the time. But I went to MSRI, the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute, that's in Berkeley, California, just up the hill from UC Berkeley. And I still am in contact with the group that I worked with. And this was, I think it was 2006, so 14 years ago. It's, you're just making friends, but you're also building your network at the same time. What else would I say? If you're going to pursue a doctorate, I think that's a fantastic idea. You've made a great decision. I would also say understand that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So don't be like, I must complete my PhD in 3 years. I must complete my PhD even in 5 years. Just take your time and do it right. You know, you want to choose the right school. So how do you choose the right school? You should visit if you can. If you can't, research as much as you can online. Also, try to talk to current graduate students. How do they feel about their program? How do they feel about the prospect of them graduating? Do they feel supported by their faculty members? Do they feel like they have a community? Are they able to get their research done, or do they find that they have to teach so many classes that they don't really have time to work on their own dissertation work? So those are good questions to ask current students at graduate schools that you are looking into. And also, you don't need to know what field you're going to do right off the bat. I think that I've always kind of known that I wanted to do mathematical epidemiology, but maybe you don't. I mean, I would just sort of choose something mathy and then, you know, sort of in a general area. I knew I wanted to do applied mathematics. Okay, so that's a starting point. Do you know if you want to do pure or applied? And if you don't know if you want to do pure or applied, but you know you want to do math, then choose a program where you have both of those choices. But I knew that I wanted to do applied mathematics. In fact, I kind of, from the beginning, knew that I wanted to work with Herb Heathcote. I'd read a lot of his papers, and I really admired and respected the work that he did. He was sort of, did a lot of the foundational work in mathematical modeling, and for that reason, I wanted to work with him. So sometimes you know, and sometimes you don't, but you don't have to feel bad if you don't. And, you know, you'll figure it out along the way. You'll figure it out when you're there. I think if you don't know, the most important thing is getting into a program. And so you definitely want to look into the faculty members that are there and the type of work that they're doing. And are you even interested in the work that they're doing? And then also a danger with what I did, knowing that I wanted to work with this one person, is, well, what if I get there and, you know, what if we don't get along? Or in my case, my thesis advisor actually decided to retire. Granted, I was 5 years in, so I was at the end. I was about to graduate. At least theoretically, I was about to graduate. But it happens sometimes, you know, that the person that you choose to be your thesis advisor retires or moves to another institution. So there has to be some backup options. You should be interested in several professors and working with several professors at a given institution. Okay, so I think that those are all of the questions that were sent to me. Again, thank you so much for listening to my talk and for listening to me talk about grad school and my own experience. So if you find that you have more questions, you can feel free to email me. And, you know, if you just want to chat too, you can just email me and we can start a dialogue. But if you have any questions about the talk or about anything that I said today, you know, if you're looking for more advice about graduate school, feel free to email me. Okay, thank you.